Hello, and welcome to the Notorious 14. My name is Chad.
And my name is Will. If you guys like unsolved crimes, extraterrestrial happenings, and the supernatural, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel at the Notorious 14.
We'd love to have you as our guest for this week's episode.
We are honored.
We are honored to have you as our guest
Yeah.
for this week episode of Edgar Allan Poe's mysterious and macabre death. Without saying more, let's get into the story.
Let's do it. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19th, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts. He lived with his parents Elizabeth Poe and David Poe Jr., who had both passed away by the time Edgar was 3 years old. Soon after, Poe went to live with his godfather, John Allan, a successful merchant in Richmond, Virginia. During Poe's schooling career, he attended school in America as well as England for grade school. Before leaving for the University of Virginia, Edgar Allan Poe and his longtime crush, Sarah Elmira Royster, confessed their love for each other and eagerly talked about marriage. They promised to send letters to each other when they separated for college. At the age of 17, Poe attended the University of Virginia under the partial funding of his godfather. Poe had done well in grade school, but on top of debt and his eventual dependency on alcohol, he performed poorly in college. Even more, he had not received any letters from Sarah. Less than a year after starting at the University of Virginia, Edgar dropped out. His godfather, John Allan, was displeased with him, disgusted by his alcohol abuse and gambling addiction he incurred while trying to pay for college. Upon returning home, he had also discovered that Sarah had married an owner of a large carting firm, Alexander Shelton. With no corners left to turn, Poe ended up enlisting in the United States Army at the age of 18. In 1827, spending 2 years in the artillery unit before voluntarily discharging himself. During this time, John Allan's wife became ill and had passed away, which Edgar gave little interest to. He decided he would try and go to West Point Academy as his next goal, which John Allan accepted and signed his application. Waiting to enter West Point, Edgar went to live with his grandmother and aunt. His older brother Henry and his cousin Virginia were also living there at the time. In 1830, Poe entered West Point as a cadet, but received no additional financial support from anybody, including John Allan. Like many of the other things Poe tried and did not accomplish in his life, he purposely got himself kicked out of West Point Academy by not attending any ceremonies for a week. After failing the academy, Poe began to work earnestly at starting his career as a professional writer. He was actually one of the first Americans to make a living by writing alone. However, he picked a very harsh time to be a writer. There were very little copyright laws to stop people from stealing his work, and many of the publishing companies refused to pay their writers after the papers were published. Being crippled by both of these facts, Poe resorted into desperate and humiliating pleas for money. After his early attempts in writing, Poe was hired by Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, Virginia, but was fired a few weeks later after being drunk on the job. After being fired, at the age of 26, Poe returned to Baltimore where he married his 13-year-old cousin Virginia Clem. In May of 1836, they held a Presbyterian wedding ceremony with a witness falsely stating Virginia's age is 21. Shortly after this, he was rehired by the messenger and moved back to Richmond with Virginia and her mother in January of 1837. During the short time he was there, Poe claimed that the circulation of Southern Literary Messenger went from 700 to 3,500. One evening in January 1842, Virginia began showing the first signs of tuberculosis, also known as consumption at the time. From the stress of her sickness, Poe began to drink alcohol heavily. After his publication company, the Broadway Journal, failed, he and Virginia moved to a cottage in Fordham, New York. In this stressful state, during January of 1845, Poe published the poem, The Raven, and it was an immediate success, making Edgar Allan Poe a household name. Sadly, only a few years later, in January of 1847, Virginia passed away from consumption, or tuberculosis. Struck with grief, Poe drowned his sorrows with alcoholism, and he became increasingly unstable. Eventually, Poe moved back to Richmond and began a relationship with his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Elmira Royster. She had been a widow ever since her husband died a few years prior. It was also discovered that none of her letters had reached Edgar because her father disapproved of them and started getting rid of them.
On Election Day, October 3rd, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found at Ryan's Tavern in Baltimore, Maryland, wearing ragged clothes and in a delirious state of mind. The man who found Poe, Joseph Walker, said that the author was in great distress and in need of immediate assistance. No one was quite sure why he was found in Baltimore, as his plans were to return home in New York. He was quickly taken to Washington College Hospital, where John Joseph Moran was his attending physician. Walker, the man who found Poe, sent a letter to an acquaintance of Poe, Joseph Snodgrass. Snodgrass described Poe's appearance as being repulsive, his shirt being dirtied, lacking a vest and unpolished shoes that were worn and did not fit well. At the hospital, Poe could not stay conscious long enough to explain why he was found in this condition. During Poe's delirious state, Moran took notice of several instances of when Poe called out the name Reynolds and mentioned his own wife living in Richmond, although Virginia had perished several years prior and he was not yet married to Sarah Elmira Royster. Sadly, on October 7th, Edgar Allan Poe passed away. "Lord help my poor soul," were the last words that Poe said before he passed away. Moran listed the cause of death as phrenitis, inflammation of the brain. However, since Poe passed away in such mysterious circumstances, there is no shortage of alternate theories on how he could have passed. There's a lot of theories. On how Edgar Allan Poe could have died. Because on his last days, he wasn't very talkative and he couldn't stay conscious long enough to explain why he was in that state. So we put our best theories in a row to explain them to you.
From least sensible to semi-sensible. We like to start off with the fact that he could have been abducted by aliens.
He probably was.
He was dazed and confused. He was abducted. Who knows what would have happened to him up there? He came back with his clothes all tattered and different, so maybe they abducted him, took all his clothes off and did their tests, and then put different clothes on him because they were like, I don't know what people wear.
Just think about it. Like,
one of the aliens messed up the paperwork and they didn't know what clothes were his.
They accidentally did something wrong with him, almost killed him. Maybe they're just having a good time up there and didn't know he was really bad with alcohol. And
you think they have alcohol in space?
Maybe.
Hopefully.
Maybe waters or alcohol.
I guess we're going to Mars.
Let's go.
They survive on alcohol. Obviously, this is one of the less sensible ones, but
or is
it? It absolutely could have happened.
It could have happened.
There are reports of all over around time of alien spacecrafts being sighted. So why not in the 1800s?
At the time, I don't think people would actually use aliens to describe, the word aliens to describe people from space.
Jesus.
So his aliens could have been a raven.
Or Jesus.
That's what he was talking about in the raven. He was explaining all of his thoughts to Yeah, it's deep.
I think we're onto something.
We're on something, so
keep looking into it.
Keep looking into it.
Do it! Let us know what you guys find. If you know Edgar Allan Poe or somebody that does, we'll be in contact.
Are you talking to the aliens or are you talking about the people?
Yes.
Because
What the aliens cloned him and then put them on their ship so they have a museum of human artifacts that are actual humans. That they keep alive. He's up there writing poetry.
He's still writing poetry.
But they're in the alien museum. He's in the alien museum.
They're out there just I told you to get poetry, not Poe. You got Poe instead.
You never listen to me.
You never listen to me.
What?
I told you 10,000 times.
So that's one of the more sensible, least sensible options on how Edgar Allan Poe might have met his demise. Aliens whacked him up.
The next theory we have actually comes from Edgar Allan Poe himself. Well, he's like, this is actually how I died. No. On his last days, Edgar Allan Poe went to Philadelphia, and he claimed that his fiancée's 3 brothers met him in Philadelphia and threatened him, saying that if he married their sister, they'd beat them up. And so he didn't want that, obviously. He didn't want to be beaten up, so he hid.
Long distance marriage.
And long distance marriage, be like, hey, honey, I'll be back in like a few years. I'm gonna hide. I'm gonna get some milk.
Too soon. Too soon.
So, if he didn't want to be beaten up again, maybe he changed his clothes, hid in Philadelphia for like a week, and then went to Baltimore to kind of throw him off tracks to then meet up with his fiancée. But her brothers met him in Baltimore, and then because they knew he had a very sensitivity to alcohol, they gave him some alcohol and then killed him.
I believe that one. That one's pretty sensible.
To add on to that theory is the fact that his fiance's dad ripped up all those letters and threw them away, and that she never received any of them. So there has to be some animosity between those families.
Yes. I absolutely believe that. It's like a more intense Romeo and Juliet. And as we discussed previously with the possibility of his cousins giving him alcohol to mess him up before they beat the crap out of him, that kind of leads into our next two theories having to do with alcohol. Mm-hmm. So Edgar Allan Poe was a notorious alcoholic throughout most of his life, as you also heard in the story. So there is a huge possibility that alcohol was involved in some way or shape or form in his demise. Yeah. One of the theories is that he could have drank too much, could have had succumbed to alcohol poisoning, which obviously when you get to that point of drunk, you are in just all over the place. You're in a tather.
Kind of a mess.
Yeah, definitely a mess.
Kind of mess.
Chris Sepner, curator for the Poe Museum, actually stated that a glass of wine was enough to make Edgar Allan Poe a staggering drunk, which seems kind of outrageous, but his sister had the same issue also. Yeah. So if it was a hereditary thing, then there's nothing that obviously he could do about it. While he was in Philadelphia, before he went to Baltimore, he had actually gotten arrested by police for being intoxicated in public. And if he was arrested, they probably took off his civilian clothes and gave him rags to, I don't know, belittle him, make him feel like he was a prisoner, because that's, I assume, what they would do in the back in those days. Make you look like you were in a slum. Yeah. Like you had been arrested. Yeah.
The police even said, like, when they picked him up, his clothes were, like, totally tattered and ragged. Mm-hmm. So they made him just like, hey, here's some old clothes we have, so put these on so you look a little bit better rather than what you look like now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he was a bum. But he definitely could have been delirious and out of it because he drank too much alcohol. Yeah. And on the other end of that spectrum is that he could not have drank enough.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, like, alcohol, there's like two way different spectrums. One's like,
since Edgar Allan Poe was extremely used to drinking alcohol every day, probably. Yeah. When he tried to stop and join the temperance movement to impress his fiancée, Elmira Royster, he could have started suffering withdrawal symptoms, which happens with any substance, including alcohol, I would assume. But he could have been delirious from that, could have been very confused and all over the place. Could explain why he ended up in Baltimore. Yeah. And not in Virginia.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. I was reading about Poe and I was like, Virginia. I was like, wait, that's the name of his cousin.
It's like, he's in Virginia. Which one? No. But no. If he didn't have enough alcohol in his system, he could have been delirious and ended up falling into a ditch or getting all beat up who knows what kind of trouble he got himself into. He was not a extremely, like, well-behaved man.
He seemed to be like a guy who's not, like, as much as I read into him, I could be totally wrong. And, like, people were, like, huge fans of Poe could, like, really correct me on this. But he seemed to be a guy who was very, like, rambunctious.
Right.
Just kind of like, oh, I'm going to do this right now. Like,
wild,
he doesn't, like, really plan stuff out too much. But I could be totally wrong about that.
I mean, even going through his story, like, you can kind of tell, like, he's got a very hard time making a decision, keeping his mind on it. Because he'd go to one place, drop out, go to another place, drop out, have issues staying in certain spots. Like, he's just kind of all over the place.
Yeah, and, like, who to say, like, that could also explain why he's in Baltimore, not in Richmond, Virginia, where he was planning to go.
Yeah,
because like halfway he'd been like, screw it, I'm going to Baltimore in these ragged clothes. Who cares? And got drunk in Philadelphia on the way.
I can see that.
So,
and say people like to drink while they're traveling.
Yeah,
unless they're in the car, and then I hope they don't.
Don't drink and drive.
No, it's
against
bad.
the law. Because Edgar Allan Poe may have joined the temperance movement and didn't drink for a little bit. He could have suffered from delirium tremens, which is a huge, like, a very bad case of withdrawal from alcohol, and he could go into this very delirious state of mind because of delirium tremens.
It's a fugue state.
Yeah, he could have died. He could have died from it.
I mean, having cold turkey withdrawal symptoms can kill people depending on the substance. So,
yeah.
Like, I can see it being a possibility, especially if he was as hardcore alcoholic as it sounds like he was.
Cooping, which was a very common practice of voters' fraud back in the day, where people would kidnap unsuspecting victims and basically make them vote for the party of their choosing. Like, if they were Democrats, to be like forced to vote for Democrat, or like whatever party the Coopers were. And so if Edgar Allan Poe was kidnapped by some Cooping Coopers, so he could have been forced to wear different garments that weren't his in order to disguise himself to vote multiple times. And it was common practice in the day that after somebody would vote, they'd get a drink of alcohol. His very bad intolerance to alcohol, he could have just died unsuspectingly from cooping because they just gave him too much alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta imagine that if they quote unquote kidnapped him, that they probably weren't very nice to him either. They were probably pretty rough and beat him up a little bit.
Yeah.
And in that case, like, between injuries and extreme alcohol intake, and like they just threw him in a ditch outside while he was passed out also from booze. Like,
yeah,
I could see that all leading up to some pretty nasty damage to his body. The voting station was also at the tavern too, so who knows if he had drinks prior. Yeah. Maybe they picked him up from the tavern while he was already intoxicated, so he got like twice as intoxicated as he had previously planned.
Yeah, and then he just got screwed over because he died.
He did.
And then, like, the way he was diagnosed at the time was with phrenitis, which was a very, like, polite way in the day to say that somebody died from alcohol poisoning. So, like, that kind of leads into the credence that he died from alcohol rather than anything else.
Yeah.
So,
some roughage, some alcohol.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of weird, like, all these theories, even though they're kind of separate, they all kind of lead into alcohol at some point.
It's associated in almost all of them.
Yeah.
Even aliens.
They're just like, hey,
party,
Edgar, yeah, we haven't seen you in a few years. So that brings the conclusion to the macabre death of Edgar Allan Poe.
We may not know what happened for sure. We've got a lot of good reasonable explanations for it. but to this day it has remained unsolved.
Yeah, tell us what you think in the comments. We're a very new channel, and this is like our first video to do in this style. So if you have any hints or like any helpful
information,
if you have any helpful information at all, just let us know, and we'll be glad to take in your tips and hints.
Yeah, absolutely.
To build our channel.
Let us know what you guys liked about the video. Let us know what you didn't like. We're very good with constructive criticism and want to make the channel better.
If you're just being a dick, keep it to yourself. Anyways, yeah, if you have any constructive criticism on how we could build this channel and how we can make these videos better, let us know. We kind of have a tight budget, so like we can't really do a lot money wise, but
this is it.
Join us next week as we talk about the mysterious disappearance of the whole colony of Roanoke.
You're not going to want to miss it.
It's even, not to spoil it, but Edgar Allan Poe kind of ties into it some reason. So tune in.